Imagine this. You've dedicated 9 years of your life to a job, turned a struggling hotel into a top performer, brought in presidents and celebrities, and personally solved a massive hidden problem corporate refused to touch. You're a legend, a cornerstone, the guy everyone relies on. Then one day management walks in, tells you you're too expensive because you're 51 years old, and replaces you with a 28-year-old MBA with zero real-world crisis experience purely for cost efficiency. Sounds bad, right? But what if that firing happened just 2 weeks before the biggest event of the year, the Champions League final, with hundreds of VIP guests relying on your hotel guests? The new guy had no idea how to handle, because your secret fix was the only thing keeping the whole place from collapsing. This isn't just a story about getting fired. This is a story about ignoring warnings, the true cost of cutting corners, and a revenge so sweet it tasted like owning your own beachfront hotel in the Caribbean. Get ready, because this story is about a hotel boss, a disastrous firing, and a revenge that tasted like sweet, sweet redemption, all kicking off right before absolute chaos erupted. All right, let's set the scene. Our main man is Calvin Rhodess. He's 51 years old, and for 9 years he'd been running the Royal Vista Hotel's flagship property right there in Miami. He wasn't just some desk jockey manager. Calvin was the guy. Under his management, this property wasn't just doing well, it was thriving. We're talking revenue jumping a massive 37% during his time there. Guest satisfaction scores consistently in the top 5% nationwide. He knew the ins and outs, handling diplomatic guests, celebrities, and major corporate events, navigating hurricanes, economic downturns, and corporate restructures. Crisis management. He'd been doing it since before his replacement even graduated college. This hotel wasn't just a job. After his wife Patricia died 4 years prior, the hotel had become his life. He sacrificed everything, working 60-hour weeks, spending holidays on site, taking emergency calls at 3 a.m., all to build this property's reputation. He knew every guest's preferences, every staff member's family situation, every vendor's delivery schedule. He had built personal relationships over 9 years with tour operators, travel agents, and corporate accounts who trusted him personally, not just the brand. Many of them had his direct line and expected him to handle their special requests. But there was a huge hidden problem brewing beneath the surface that corporate leadership, specifically the regional director Mason Clark, seemed determined to ignore. The reservation system, which corporate had upgraded 18 months prior, was a total nightmare. It simply couldn't properly sync with third-party booking platforms like ExpediaHotels.com or even their own corporate website. What did this mean on the ground chaos? Rooms would get double-booked. Confirmations would vanish into the digital ether. VIP suites would suddenly show as unavailable even if they were sitting empty. It was a constant mess. Calvin brought this glaring issue to Mason Clark's attention repeatedly. What was Mason's response? Always the same. Work with what we have, Calvin. A new system isn't in the budget. So, what did Calvin, the dedicated fixer, do? He didn't just shrug and work with what he had, in the standard sense. He taught himself basic coding on weekends. Yes, he used his personal time outside of his already packed work schedule to build a solution corporate refused to pay for. He wrote a script, a manual script that would run every single morning at 6 a.m. Its job: to catch discrepancies, flag phantom bookings, and manually sync the databases with all those crucial third-party platforms. It wasn't pretty, not elegant, as he described it, but it worked. From corporate's perspective, looking at the numbers, the system seemed stable. Why? Because Calvin was the invisible foundation fixing the broken system behind the scenes every single day for free. Then came the meeting that changed everything. Mason Clark walked in with that corporate smile that never reached his eyes. Behind him stood the future Trevor Sims. 28 years old, fresh out of an MBA program, probably making about half of Calvin's salary. The reason for this abrupt change: cost efficiency is key in today's market, Mason explained, sliding a folder across Calvin's desk. You've done excellent work here, Calvin, but we need to adapt. It was cold business math. They needed younger management, cheaper management. At 51, despite his results, Calvin was deemed too expensive. The timing was absolutely brutal. The Champions League final was scheduled in London in just 14 days. Their Miami property wasn't just booked, it was booked solid for months as an overflow location. We're talking UEFA representatives, international media, corporate sponsors, who couldn't get rooms in London. A massive influx of incredibly important high-stakes guests. Mason assured Calvin the transition would be seamless. Trevor, he claimed, had experience with high-volume operations. Trevor eagerly nodded along. Calvin, the veteran, the crisis manager, knew instantly that Trevor's experience, probably just managing a standard Marriott in Orlando as he thought, didn't remotely qualify him for the complexity of the Royal Vista flagship, especially not with the hidden issues. But Calvin didn't argue. He just asked, "When do you need me out?" Mason's reply, "End of this week would be ideal." Just days before the Champions League final, chaos was set to descend. Calvin spent his final 3 days cleaning out his office, handing over keycards and trying to brief Trevor. He watched Trevor take notes on standard guest protocols, VIP preferences, staff schedules, vendor contracts, all the normal stuff. But the one crucial thing Trevor never asked about the reservation system fixes. Mason had dismissed the need for a detailed handover on systems, saying, "He'll figure it out." These younger managers adapt quickly to technology. Right then, Calvin knew. He knew they were going to learn the hard way. On his last day, Calvin sat in his car watching the staff through the lobby windows. These were the people he'd led, supported, and gotten through tough times for nearly a decade. Now they were Trevor's problem. He drove away, leaving them to face the inexperienced leadership. And what they didn't know, what Mason and Trevor didn't know, was that Calvin's custom script, the secret fix, holding everything together, would stop running in just 72 hours. Without it, the system would revert to its broken default state. All the manual fixes, the syncs, the corrections he'd made daily would disappear. By the time the final Champions League overflow bookings were confirmed, none of those essential updates would stick. But as Calvin saw it then, that wasn't his problem anymore. The difference between Miami and other properties where Mason had pulled this trick hire experienced build reputation replaced with cheaper was that those places had functioning systems. Miami, due to Calvin's workarounds, was handling twice its designed capacity, running on manual fixes and personal relationships. Calvin had given his staff his personal cell number at his final meeting, telling them to call if anything came up they couldn't handle through normal channels. His assistant, Elena, who'd been nervous about the transition, "Trevor seems nice, but he doesn't understand how complex this operation is," she'd said, hugged him, and told him the place wouldn't be the same without him. She was more right than she knew. The first sign of trouble came 5 days after Calvin left on Tuesday morning. Elena called, her voice strained. "Calvin, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a problem with the Champions League bookings." Calvin was finally relaxing, drinking coffee, having slept past 7:00 a.m. for the first time in 9 years. "What kind of problem?" he asked. "The system is showing conflicting reservations," Elena explained. "We have 43 VIP suites booked for the same dates, but we only have 31 VIP suites total." Trevor's take: "He says it's just a display error." Calvin knew instantly. His script hadn't run in 5 days. The broken system was back. He asked if they'd tried a manual sync. "Trevor doesn't know what that means," Elena replied. adding that Trevor thought corporate would send a tech team next week. Next week, that would be far too late. Guests were arriving Friday, the final was in 9 days. Calvin urgently told Elena to manually check every single reservation cross-reference confirmation numbers with room assignments. Trevor's response: "He said not to worry about it. He thinks I'm overreacting." Calvin hung up, looking out his window. Part of him wanted to go fix it, but he'd been replaced by someone who clearly undervalued experience and thought problems would solve themselves. The second call came 2 days later on Thursday. This time, it was Trevor himself. "Calvin, hi, Elena mentioned you might know something about our booking system. We're having some minor discrepancies." Minor discrepancies? Calvin thought, almost laughing. He asked what Trevor was seeing. "Well, some of our Champions League guests seem to be double booked. Not a big deal. We'll just move them to comparable rooms," Trevor said. "How many double bookings?" Calvin asked. "Maybe 60 or 70. The system shows available inventory, so we should be fine 60 or 70. The kid was completely clueless about the scale of the disaster unfolding. Calvin decided it was time for the truth. "Trevor, you need to understand something. The available inventory numbers aren't accurate. The system has been broken for over a year. I was fixing it manually every morning." Trevor's naive response: "Oh, well, corporate should have documentation on that." "Corporate doesn't know," Calvin stated plainly. "I developed the fix myself on my own time." A long pause. Then Trevor's voice desperate. "So how do I fix it?" Calvin laid it out. "You'd need to manually audit every single reservation check for duplicates, verify room assignments, and cross-reference with all third-party platforms. It would take about 40 hours if you knew what you were doing." 40 hours. The guests start arriving tomorrow. Calvin sat there listening to Trevor breathe. This was the moment. He could drive over, fix the mess, be the hero, save their weekend. Or he could let them see the true consequences of firing him, what the hotel looked like without the invisible fixes. He chose the latter. "I'm sorry, Trevor, I'm not an employee anymore," he said, and hung up. Then he turned off his phone. Friday morning, 11:00 a.m. Calvin was in his garage, finally getting to organize tools he hadn't touched in years. His doorbell rang. Standing on his porch was Mason Clark in a wrinkled suit, looking like he hadn't slept. "Calvin, we need to talk." Calvin leaned against his doorframe. "About what?" Mason's face darkened. "You know about what the hotel is in crisis mode. We have VIP guests arriving in 3 hours and nowhere to put them." Calvin's calm reply: "That sounds like a management problem." Mason accused him: "Don't play games with me. Elena said you knew about system issues and didn't report them properly." Calvin didn't flinch. "I reported them for 18 months. You told me to work with what we had." Mason shot back: "You should have documented your workarounds. This is sabotage." Calvin almost laughed. "Sabotage? I fixed your broken system for free on my own time for over a year. You fired me and replaced me with someone who doesn't know how hotels work. That's not sabotage, Mason. That's consequences." "Fix it," Mason demanded. "I'm not your employee." "I'll rehire you," Mason offered. "Temporary basis, full salary." Calvin looked at Mason, desperate, clearly calculating the personal cost of this disaster. His precious Champions League partnership was about to evaporate because he'd thought experience was replaceable. "No thanks," Calvin said. Mason stepped closer, pleading, "Calvin, be reasonable. This affects innocent people, staff members, guests who did nothing wrong." Calvin's cutting response: "You should have thought about that before you decided I was too expensive." As Calvin started to close the door, Mason grabbed it. "I'll call corporate. Tell them you deliberately withheld critical operational information. Calvin was ready. Go ahead. My severance agreement includes a non-disparagement clause. Works both ways, Mason. You accuse me of anything, and I'll tell corporate exactly how long you've known about the system failures. Mason's hand dropped from the door. You want to destroy me? He asked. I don't want anything from you. I just want to be left alone, Calvin stated, closing the door. Calvin watched through the window as Mason stood on his porch for 5 more minutes before leaving. 20 minutes later, his phone started ringing off the hook. Unknown numbers, probably corporate executives, angry guests. He sent them all to voicemail. By 2:00 p.m., the calls were constant. He listened to one, a frantic message from UEFA's travel coordinator talking about missing reservations and legal obligations. He deleted it. At 4:00 p.m., Elena called from her personal phone. Calvin, it's worse than we thought. The lobby was packed with people holding confirmation numbers for rooms that simply didn't exist. Trevor had panicked and locked himself in the office. Mason was screaming at everyone. Guests were threatening lawsuits. How many people are affected? Calvin asked. Over 200, Elena replied. Corporate executives, UEFA officials, international press, all there for the Champions League coverage. Some had flown in from Europe specifically because the hotel guaranteed accommodations. Calvin could hear the shouting in the background, multiple voices in different languages. What's Trevor doing? He asked. Elena explained Trevor called corporate, but it was Friday afternoon. Nobody was answering. He'd tried to manually reassign rooms, but he didn't understand the system at all. He's made it worse, Elena said. Made it worse how? Calvin pressed. He accidentally canceled reservations for guests who are already checked in. Now we have people who were told their rooms are gone, even though they've been here for 3 days. The kid had completely panicked, just clicking random buttons. A classic mistake for someone overwhelmed. Elena, amidst the chaos, pleaded, Calvin, I'm sorry you're dealing with this. Can't you come in just for today? The staff respects you. Maybe you could calm things down. Calvin looked out his window at the palm trees swaying. For 9 years, Friday afternoons meant prepping for weekend arrivals, checking VIP protocols, confirming special requests. Now he was watching birds and thinking about dinner plans. I can't do that, Elena. Why not? She asked. Because the moment I walk through that door, Mason will claim I'm responsible for fixing this, Calvin explained. I'll be working weekends again, handling crisis calls, covering for broken systems, and the next time they want to cut costs, I'll be right back where I started. So you're just going to let it burn? Elena asked. I'm not letting anything burn, Calvin corrected her. I just stopped putting out fires that weren't mine. Saturday morning, Calvin woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Elena, UEFA officials, Mason, even a text from Trevor begging for help. His sister-in-law texted asking if he was okay after seeing the news about his old hotel. News. He turned on his laptop. First result, a Miami Herald article. Headline, VIP hotel disaster leaves Champions League guests stranded. Below it, a photo of the lobby packed with angry people in suitcases. The article was brutal. Over 200 VIP guests left without accommodations. A catastrophic system failure eliminated confirmed reservations. Quotes from angry guest, threats of lawsuits, speculation about the hotel's future with UEFA. But the key detail for Calvin was buried deeper in the article. The crisis comes just 2 weeks after the hotel replaced its longtime general manager, Calvin Rhodess, with Trevor Sims, a younger executive, brought in as part of a cost-cutting initiative. The media had connected the dots. His phone rang. Mason again. Calvin answered. What do you want? Have you seen the news? Mason asked frantically. Just read it, Calvin said. "This is a disaster, Calvin. We're going to lose our UEFA contract. Corporate is flying in from Atlanta. My job is on the line." "I'm sorry to hear that," Calvin replied. "You're not sorry. You planned this," Mason accused. Calvin set down his coffee. "Mason, let me explain something. I didn't plan anything. I developed a workaround for your broken system because you refused to fix it properly. When you fired me, my workaround stopped working. That's not a plan. That's basic cause and effect." "You could have warned us," Mason argued. "I did warn you," Calvin said. "For 18 months you told me to make do with what we had." Mason clarified, "I mean specifically, you should have told Trevor about your script." Calvin's simple truth. Trevor never asked. He was too busy adapting quickly to technology. A long pause. Calvin could hear angry voices in the background. "What's it going to take?" Mason finally asked. "What do you mean?" Calvin replied. "To fix this, to come back and clean up the mess." Calvin looked out at his backyard planning a vegetable garden. A simple project with clear steps and predictable results, unlike managing the Royale Vistas mess. "I'm not coming back, Mason." "Name your price," Mason insisted. "It's not about price. You made it clear that my experience wasn't valuable, that a younger, cheaper manager could do the same job, so let him do it." Then Mason dropped a piece of news that surprised Calvin. Trevor quit this morning. He'd walked out at 7:00 a.m. overwhelmed. Calvin almost felt sorry for the kid. Almost. "Then find another young, adaptable manager," Calvin said. "Calvin, please," Mason begged. "I'll give you anything. Full control salary increase, guaranteed job security." "For how long?" Calvin asked pointedly. "Until the next cost-cutting initiative." There was no answer. "That's what I thought." Mason called back Sunday morning with a new offer. A consulting contract, 6 months, remote work, set his own schedule, 3 times his previous salary. This got Calvin's attention. He was sitting on his porch reading a book for the first time in years. "Remote from where?" he asked. "Wherever you want, your choice." And what would he be consulting on? System integration, crisis management, staff training, whatever it takes to stabilize the operation. 3 times his salary would be substantial, enough to buy a small place somewhere warm, maybe the Caribbean, and actually retire comfortably. "Send me the contract terms," Calvin said. The contract arrived 2 hours later. 6 months renewable by mutual agreement. Payment up front, complete operational authority for system fixes and staff training. No requirement to be physically present except for quarterly reviews. It was incredibly generous. Calvin called Elena to get the full picture. "How bad is it?" They were still housing guests in the conference center. Corporate brought in a crisis management team manually rebuilding the reservation database from scratch. They estimated it would take 2 weeks minimum, but that wasn't the worst of it. "Elena, here's the thing nobody's talking about publicly," Calvin said. "We lost more than just the Champions League guests." Word had gotten out to their regular corporate accounts. 3 major companies canceled their annual conferences. 2 wedding parties moved to other venues. The damage wasn't just a single weekend, it was long-term. Calvin had suspected as much. Hotel reputation crises spread fast through industry networks. Travel agents, event planners, corporate travel departments, they all talked. "What's the financial impact?" Calvin asked. Elena had overheard Mason telling corporate it could be over $2 million in lost revenue, plus penalties for the UEFA contract violations. $2 million. That was roughly what they had tried to save by replacing Calvin with Trevor. Except now they'd lost both the savings and the revenue. Elena. Calvin mused, "Hypothetically, if I were to help fix this remotely, what would you need most?" Her answer was direct. Honestly, we need someone who understands the whole system, not just the technology but the relationships. Half our VIP accounts were calling for you personally. They don't trust the hotel anymore, but they trust you." That gave Calvin an idea. He spent the rest of Sunday reading industry publications and making quiet phone calls to the contacts he'd built over the years. Travel agents, event planners, corporate account managers. The word on the street was exactly what he expected. Royale Vista Miami was radioactive. No one wanted to risk booking there until they proved they could handle complex events reliably. But several people mentioned something interesting. If Calvin Rhodess was personally guaranteeing the service quality, they might consider giving the property another chance. Monday morning, Calvin called Mason back. "I'll take the consulting contract," he said, "with modifications." "What modifications?" Mason asked. "First, I work exclusively from outside Florida. I'm thinking somewhere in the Caribbean." Mason agreed. "Fine." "Second, all client communications go through me personally, not corporate, not the property management. Me." Mason hesitated. "That's unusual, but okay." "Third, I want oversight on hiring decisions for the general manager position. No more 28-year-old MBAs." A pause from the Mason. "That might be difficult," he said. "Those are my terms, Mason," Calvin stated. "Take them or keep cleaning up the mess yourself." Defeated, Mason asked, "How soon can you start?" Calvin looked at his calendar, empty except for a dentist appointment. "I'll start next Monday from Barbados." "Barbados?" Mason repeated. "I'm thinking a change of scenery would be good for my consulting perspective," Calvin replied. 2 days later, Calvin was booking flights and looking at beachfront rental properties. For the first time in years, he was excited about work again. The big difference. This time, he was calling the shots. 3 months later, Calvin was sitting on a terrace overlooking the Caribbean Sea, laptop open, coffee in hand. The Miami property had stabilized. His remote system monitoring was working perfectly. Staff confidence had returned and bookings were approaching normal levels. But the real victory came in an email from corporate headquarters. Mason Clark had been terminated. The email was from the regional vice president apologizing for the management decisions that led to operational disruptions. It announced a renewed commitment to experienced leadership. And then came the offer, the regional director position. Mason's old job. Calvin read the email twice. Then he deleted it. An hour later, his phone rang. The call he'd been expecting. "Calvin, this is James Morrison, Vice President of Operations. Did you see our offer?" "I saw it," Calvin confirmed. "We'd like you to consider coming back in a leadership capacity. Your consulting work has been exceptional." "Thank you," Calvin said, "but I'm not interested." "Can I ask why?" James asked. "The compensation package is substantial." Calvin looked out at the ocean, at a fishing boat heading toward the horizon. The captain knew those waters understood the currents and weather the best spots. "James," Calvin said, "I spent 9 years building your Miami property's reputation. When you decided experience was too expensive, you nearly destroyed it in one weekend. Now you want me to fix the whole region." "We've learned from our mistakes," James claimed. "Have you?" Calvin countered. "Or are you just scared of the next crisis? What would it take to get you back?" James pressed one last time. "Nothing," Calvin said. "I'm exactly where I want to be." He hung up and opened his real estate app. There it was. A small hotel for sale in Barbados. 28 rooms, beachfront location, owner retiring. The price was reasonable, especially with his consulting income. For the first time in his career, he'd be working for himself. 6 months later, Calvin owned the Sunset Bay Hotel in Barbados. 15 staff members, mostly locals with decades in hospitality. No corporate headquarters breathing down his neck. No cost-cutting initiatives sacrificing quality. no regional directors telling him how to run his business. One afternoon, while reviewing reservation reports, his phone rang. Elena's number. "Calvin, I have news. Good news or bad news?" he asked. "Good news," she said. "We're finally back to full capacity. The Champions League disaster is ancient history. New general manager is working out well." "That's great, Elena," Calvin replied. "There's something else," she added. "Mason tried to get a job with Marriott in Orlando. They called me for a reference." "And?" Calvin prompted. "And I told them the truth," Elena said. "About the system failures, the firing, everything that happened." "What did they say?" Calvin asked. "They thanked me and said they'd found another candidate." Calvin smiled. Hotel management was indeed a small world, and word traveled fast. "Elena, can I ask you something?" Calvin asked. "Sure," she replied. "Do you ever miss the chaos?" She laughed. "Never. We have boring, predictable operations now. It's wonderful." That evening, Calvin walked down to the beach behind his hotel. 3 guests were having dinner on the terrace. A couple from Canada celebrating their anniversary. Calvin had personally arranged fresh lobster from a local fisherman and champagne from his own wine selection. Simple hospitality, personal service. No corporate protocols or profit margins to worry about. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister-in-law, Julia. "Saw the article about your hotel in Travel and Leisure. Mom would be proud." He looked back at his small property, lights glowing warmly. 28 rooms. But each one mattered. Each guest was his personal responsibility. He'd spent 9 years building someone else's dream. Now he was living his own. Man, what a story, right? From being tossed aside for being too expensive at 51, despite being the absolute rock star, holding the place together to watching the whole thing spectacularly collapse, and finally building his own empire from the ashes. This story hits on so many levels. It's about the value of experience that corporate often ignores. It's about knowing your worth and not letting people treat you as disposable. And it's about the sweet, undeniable power of consequences when warnings are ignored. Was Calvin's action revenge? Or was he simply allowing a broken system one they refused to fix to finally act like the broken system it was? He didn't sneak in and sabotage anything. He just stopped providing the free, off-the-books fix they took for granted. And in the end, he didn't just get back at them. He used the situation to elevate himself to achieve the dream of owning his own hotel. He didn't go back to fix their problems permanently, even when they offered him the regional director job. He chose freedom, peace, and building something for himself. It really makes you think about how often companies make short-sighted decisions for immediate cost savings only to face exponentially larger costs down the line, not just financially but in reputation and lost talent. And it shows that sometimes walking away is the strongest move you can make. What do you guys think? Was Calvin justified in letting the system collapse after being fired? Or should he have stepped in for the sake of the staff and guests? Have you ever witnessed a situation where management's bad decisions led to a total meltdown? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many as I can. If you were hooked by this story, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss more incredible, real-life tales like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.